Good morning, boys and girls. We have the olive branch and sword. We're going to start with our social studies ring. Make sure that you are following along and paying attention.
Most governments try to avoid using war to fix problems. Wars cost many lives and a lot of money. Many of the American colonists who wanted to break away from England did not want a war. They were angry about taxes and unfair laws, but colonists still hoped to settle these differences peacefully. Across the ocean, men like William Pitt and Edmund Burke made pleas in Parliament for moderation too. In 1775, representatives from each of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. This meeting was called the Second Continental Congress. John Hancock and Benjamin Franklin were two important people who went to the meeting. The delegates had to decide what the colonies were going to do after early battles between colonists and British soldiers. The battles had made a lot of people nervous. They knew that a war would be very hard to win. King George's army was highly trained and well equipped. The colonial army would need to be trained to fight against expert British troops. The delegates also knew that their army would need supplies. Soldiers would need everything from guns and ammunition to socks, boots, and blankets. The Second Continental Congress split into two groups. One group of delegates worked to prepare for war. The other group spent several months working toward peace. John Adams referred to the strategy as holding the sword in one hand and the olive branch in the other. An olive branch is a symbol of peace. John Dickinson was a delegate from Pennsylvania. He wanted the colonies to stay a part of England. Dickinson wrote the Olive Branch Petition and asked the Congress to send it to King George. Even though King George had ignored a letter that the First Continental Congress had sent the year before, the delegates decided to try again. Congress approved the message on July 5th, 1775. King George refused to even read the Olive Branch Petition and declared that the colonies were in rebellion. England had ignored the olive branch, and war was almost certain.
Okay, so they tried to go to the king and they asked him, hey, this is what we want instead, and he refused. So this is where the war happens. Okay, the next part we're going to read, outwitting them all.
George Washington had a reputation for honesty, but as a general in the Revolutionary War, he used spies, hidden messages, and trickery to fight the British. As part of this strategy, Washington formed a group of spies known as the Culper Ring. Spies in this group worked hard to protect their identities, and they only used numbers when communicating with each other and with Washington. One of the best spies in this group was a woman who went by the code name Agent 355. Very little is known about Agent 355, although historians agree she was most likely from a wealthy British family. She lived in the New York area and would leave coded messages in the pockets of laundry hanging on a clothesline. One day, however, the messages simply stopped. Historians believe she was caught and executed by the British. Today, there are still people guessing the identity of Agent 355. Some believe she was Anne Strong, a known spy and patriot of the time. Others have guessed she was Betty Floyd, a cousin of one of the leaders of the Culper Ring. Although we will probably never know for sure who Agent 355 was, her actions and bravery helped the colonies win the Revolutionary War.
Okay, so we know that they had to use trickery and spies at the time because they were trying to survive. The British soldiers were very, very strong, so they had to figure out a way how they can still plan and work together in order to win. So this one is going to be about the road to independence.
What made the colonists finally decide to write the Declaration of Independence and send it to the king? Well, after the
So the Declaration of Independence is basically declaring that they want independence from the British, from England. And of course, King George was not happy with that. He did not want them to be free because that meant that he couldn't continue taxing them and getting money, and he was very greedy.
Boston Tea Party, King George closed Boston Harbor. Nobody was allowed to ship anything in or out. The colonists were furious and weren't going to let the king get away with this. They began to stockpile gunpowder and as many guns as they could lay their hands on, just in case they needed them later. The British caught wind of that and started to confiscate, take away colonists' weapons. Meanwhile, the colonies began to organize. They realized that they would be more powerful if they worked together. Colonists had been forming committees since 1764. They communicated with other colonies about matters including paper money and the Stamp Act. In 1772, Bostonians organized a more official Committee of Correspondence and urged other colonies to do the same. By 1774, 11 of the 13 colonies had joined the network of communication with committees of their own. The next step of organization and communication would be a historic meeting in Philadelphia. These committees were significant because it was the first time that the colonists had organized to act for their own interests. The committees enabled the first steps of the Revolution. First Continental Congress. In the fall of 1774, representatives from all of the colonies, except for Georgia, had a meeting, or Congress, in Philadelphia. You might have heard of some of the delegates: Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Adams, and George Washington. They called this the First Continental Congress, and spent almost 2 months debating the next steps to take. They voted to send a strong letter to King George asking him to give them certain rights. They also agreed to meet again the next year if their requests were denied. King George refused to even read the letter. After that, colonists again boycotted British goods. However, they weren't foolish enough to think the king wouldn't send more soldiers to defend his rules. Redcoats arrived by the hundreds. Colonists organized their own militias, groups of citizen soldiers, in towns and cities. Some were called.
When they're talking about redcoats, they're talking about the soldiers that wore red from Britain. So they came to fight every single time that the Americans didn't want to obey to the rules.
Minutemen because they could be ready to fight the British in 60 seconds or less. They didn't have bright red jackets or fancy boots, but they had lots of heart and one goal: independence. People started thinking the colonies could be a separate country with no more ties to England and the king. They wanted to be the United States of America. The small colonial militias were ready to take on big, bad Britain. Take that, King George. No more taxation without representation. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. The Patriots and Loyalists began to have many heated arguments within the colonies. The British soldiers figured they had better find those stashed weapons, as well as those traitors, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Colonists moved their weapons and supplies to Concord, Massachusetts. Paul Revere and other Minutemen wisely created a warning system. When British soldiers approached Boston, Patriots would light lanterns in the Old North Church. They would light 1 lantern if the British came by land, and 2 if by sea. When Revere saw the light, he would warn people across the countryside. So, did he take out his cell phone and send a tweet to warn everyone? If cell phones had been around then, it would have been a great idea. Since they weren't invented yet, he had to do things the old-fashioned way. He warned them on horseback. This is how it happened. On the night of April 18th, 1775, British ships stealthily arrived. A patriot climbed the church tower and lit 2 lanterns. Minuteman Paul Revere jumped on a horse and rode with his friend William Dawes to Lexington on the way to Concord. He wanted to warn Adams, Hancock, and others that the British were coming by sea. Lexington and Concord. The British were angry. They had been exposed. They decided to march from Boston to Lexington, where they heard the weapons were concealed, hidden. Of course, we know the weapons were farther along the road in Concord. Revere and Dawes kept riding to warn fellow patriots. Along the way, they met Samuel Prescott, who joined the ride. The British captured Revere, but Dawes and Prescott escaped. Prescott made it to Concord and spread the word. On April 19th, 1775, the Redcoats arrived in Lexington at daybreak, ready to fight. Minutemen in Lexington met a large troop of British soldiers. A shot was fired. The American Revolution had truly begun. Sadly, the colonists at Lexington took quite a beating, and many were killed. But that's not the end of this beginning. A spy told the British general that they'd been tricked again, and that the weapons were actually in Concord. Bad news for the British. Thanks to Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, the colonists heard the British were coming and moved the weapons once again. Then they gathered at Concord's North Bridge and waited for the Redcoats. When the British got there, the Patriots began shooting furiously. The British were shocked. They tried to run back to Boston, but they were attacked all along the way. If King George thought the Americans wouldn't or couldn't fight his armies, he was wrong. He was going to have to get serious about bringing order back to his colonies. Second Continental Congress. The colonists were ready and had ideas of their own. The Second Continental Congress began meeting in Philadelphia in May 1775. The events of the previous months gave the colonists much to talk about. The delegates took the next step of strengthening the local militias into a real continental army. George Washington was named as the commander-in-chief. Many delegates were still hoping to prevent a bloody fight for independence. They sent King George another appeal for peace called the Olive Branch Petition. Like the letter sent earlier, King George refused to receive the petition. To make matters worse, he hired German soldiers called Hessians to try and control the colonists. Congress continued to meet, and it became the unofficial government of the colonies. In these confusing times, colonists could only hope that common sense would take over, but they would be prepared either way. The Battle of Bunker Hill. At Breed's Hill? 2 months after those shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, another important fight took place in Massachusetts. You may have heard about the Battle of Bunker Hill in Charleston. On June 16th, 1775, the Patriots were ordered to strengthen the position at Bunker Hill, which overlooked the all-important Boston Harbor. Instead, the troops marched past Bunker Hill to a spot known as Breed's Hill and dug in there. General Prescott led the Patriots. In the bloodiest battle so far, British and Americans fought for over 2 hours before Prescott ordered a retreat. The Patriots lost the battle, but they'd fought so well that everyone knew they were ready, willing, and able to fight against King George's army.
Okay, so they had a battle before the huge battle, but they fought against part of his army, and they did pretty well. So let's see what happens next. King George.
King George III was born in London on June 4th, 1738. He was 22 years old when he was crowned King of Great Britain and Ireland. The next year, he married a woman named Charlotte. She was the daughter of a duke from a small territory in Germany. George and Charlotte had a happy marriage with 15 children. George reigned for 59 years, but many of them were filled with stress and hard choices. King George III is remembered mainly for being the king the American colonies fought against. Although George wanted the colonies to stay under his rule, it was Parliament who made most of the decisions. Parliament was England's most powerful government group. Parliament's job was to work with the king to support and protect the country in any way it could. George III became king just as the French and Indian War was ending. He had won the war, but it had been very expensive. George III and Parliament needed money to run the country. The colonies were meant to be a source of income, so Parliament thought it made sense to raise their taxes. They passed the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts to raise money to pay for the war. The taxes were very unpopular in the colonies. They eventually led to war. The colonies declared independence in 1776 and won their freedom a few years later. Even though many of his subjects knew he had defended England, George III took the defeat badly. As years passed, however, America and England became strong trading partners. The countries also became allies or friends. After almost 50 years on the throne, King George III grew tired and ill. Eventually, he was too sick to rule. His son George IV ruled for him until George III died in 1820.
Okay, so they tell you that America eventually wins, but we continue to trade with England.
Thomas Paine was a failure as a student, sailor, businessman, and soldier. But wow, could he write! He published pamphlets in colonial America that stirred the hearts of people in a way that no one else had ever done. Born in England in 1737, Paine dropped out of school at a young age. He bounced around in various jobs without success. He worked for his father, then as a sailor, then as a tax collector. But his life changed when he met Benjamin Franklin, who convinced him to come to America in 1774. Paine was caught up in the fever for independence that was sweeping the colonies. He wrote a pamphlet, a small newspaper or magazine, much like an issue of Studies Weekly, titled Common Sense. It made a passionate argument that the only choice for the colonists was to fight for their independence from Britain. His clear and logical writing spoke to the people. Common Sense sold thousands of copies, and Paine became famous. He wrote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand. History has proven how true his words were." Paine joined the Continental Army and discovered he wasn't cut out to be a soldier either. Writing was his special skill. His next pamphlet, The Crisis, contains his most famous line, "These are the times that try men's souls." General Washington had Paine's pamphlets read aloud to encourage the American troops during the Revolution. Paine's facts and ideas were clear and persuasive. Many of his ideas were written into the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, the core of our government. When have you been successful in using your words to change someone's mind? Can you think of other times when...
Okay, so he was the brains behind the Declaration of Independence. He wrote what ideas he wanted America to look like. Now, let's see what happened in Bunker Hill. I wonder if they really show you a lot of it.
Whenever possible, military leaders are eager to plan and prepare the attacks or defense of ground at stake in times of war. The Battle of Bunker Hill did not quite go as planned. Though the map shown here was drawn by an officer on the spot, Breed's Hill is not even marked. Historians have confirmed that British and American troops were engaged there on June 17, 1775. Working with a classmate, study the map shown and answer the questions below. Several of the questions may require research. Be sure to use the library or online resources approved by your teacher.
Okay, you do not have to do that, but in your Google Classroom, you have a quiz. Please make sure that you put the link into the chat box for peers who cannot find the link. Please make sure to complete it. Once you are done with class for today. So please make sure you send in your quiz. Remember, report cards at the end of the trimester are due soon. So please make sure you get that done, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, my friends.
Sure.